My name is Jonas Keene. I came to the vast, unforgiving wilderness of Alaska to bury the ghosts of my past, to trade the echoes of gunfire for the whisper of the wind through pine trees. I wasn't alone. I had Atlas, my German shepherd, a silent guardian who carried the same stoic discipline I once had. And I had Luna, my husky, the untamable spirit of the north, whose boundless energy pulled us deeper into the wild. We were a pack, and we were searching for peace. Instead, we found a tomb of ice and steel. During a routine hunt, Luna's frantic digging led us not to prey, but to the glint of metal buried deep beneath the permafrost. We uncovered a hatch, sealed for decades. Below it lay a forgotten Cold War research station, perfectly preserved as if abandoned only yesterday. But this was no historical relic. Deep inside its frozen halls, we found a sealed laboratory, and within it a device that pulsed with a faint otherworldly light, a secret that should have remained buried forever. I see now that our discovery was no accident. This station wasn't abandoned. It was hidden. The moment I bypassed its final security lock, I didn't just unlock a door. I tripped an alarm that had been silent for half a century. A single invisible signal shot out from the heart of this frozen wasteland, and my life of solitude was over. The ghosts I was running from are nothing compared to the hunters now closing in. We are no longer explorers. We are the prey. Today I invite you to join my pack on this journey, to uncover the secret frozen in the ice, and to fight alongside us for survival. If you believe in the unbreakable bond between a man and his dogs, support our story by subscribing to the channel. It all began on a morning that felt like any other. The Alaskan sun was a pale disk in a vast blue sky, and the air was so cold it burned to breathe. It all began on a morning that felt like any other. The Alaskan sun was a pale disk in a vast blue sky, and the air was so cold it burned to breathe. This was the peace I had sought. In the service, everything was noise. The roar of a Black Hawk's rotors, the crackle of comms, the deafening finality of an explosion. Out here, the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the snow and the rhythmic panting of my pack. This silence wasn't empty. It was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on the chaotic memories, and on good days, smoothed their sharp edges. I had traded a world defined by objectives and enemies for one governed by seasons and survival. My mission was no longer to fight, but simply to be. But a man like me is never truly without his ghosts. They live in the quiet moments, in the way a snapped twig can sound like a distant rifle shot, or how the northern lights can flicker like muzzle flashes against a desert sky. I was Sergeant Jonas Keene of the 1st Special Forces Group for 12 years. I was good at it. Too good. I learned how to become a ghost myself, how to read a landscape for threats, how to exist in a state of hypervigilance that became so ingrained it followed me home. That's the part they don't tell you about in debriefings. The war doesn't end when you leave the battlefield. You just carry it to a new one. Alaska, with its endless, indifferent wilderness, was supposed to be my final tour, a tour of peace. My new unit was smaller and infinitely more loyal. Atlas, my German shepherd, was my shadow. I'd found him at a rescue, specializing in former military working dogs, a soldier like me deemed too intense for civilian life. His dark sable coat was the color of midnight, and his eyes held a deep knowing intelligence. He moved with a quiet economy of motion, a silent professional who was always assessing, always watching. When the nightmares came, a heavy paw on my chest and the solid warm weight of his body beside me was the only thing that could anchor me to the present. He was my discipline, my training, the part of me that survived. And then there was Luna. She was the wild heart of our pack, a Siberian husky, with eyes the color of glacial ice and a spirit as untamed as the land itself. I'd found her as a stray, a blur of white fur and chaotic energy on the outskirts of Fairbanks. While Atlas was my anchor, Luna was my compass, constantly pulling us forward, her nose twitching with the sheer joy of discovery. She was pure primal instinct. She reminded me that there was still a world beyond calculated threats and strategic positions, a world of simple, exhilarating existence. They were perfect opposites, the disciplined soldier and the wild explorer, and together they made me whole. They were my peace. That day, we were tracking a caribou herd across a high windswept plateau, a place few humans ever set foot. The snow was deep, the wind a constant biting force that whipped tears from my eyes. Atlas walked at my heel, his head low, conserving energy with the efficiency of a seasoned operator. Luna, as always, was 100 yards ahead, a white phantom dancing between the skeletal remains of ancient pines. It was she who sensed it first. She stopped dead. Her playful, loping gait vanished, replaced by a tense, rigid posture. Her head was cocked, her ears swiveling, her nose pointed not at the caribou tracks, but at a featureless expanse of snow-covered ground. She let out a low whine, a sound of confusion, not excitement. Atlas immediately tensed beside me, a low growl rumbling in his chest. His gaze followed hers, and the fur along his spine bristled. My own senses went on high alert. I trusted their instincts more than my own. They were the early warning system my training could never replicate. The caribou were forgotten. "What is it, Luna? What do you have?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the wind. She didn't look back. She began to dig, not with the playful frenzy of chasing a vole, but with a desperate, obsessive energy. Paws flying, she sent plumes of snow into the air. I unslung my rifle, my eyes scanning the horizon. Was it a predator's den? A bear hibernating? But the ground was too exposed, too barren. Atlas moved forward cautiously, circling the spot, his body low to the ground. Then I heard it. A sound that had no place in this world of rock and ice. A sharp, metallic scrape. Luna's claws had hit something that wasn't earth. My heart hammered against my ribs. I moved forward quickly, pulling the collapsible shovel from my pack. "Easy, girl. Let me see." Together we worked. I shoveled while she and Atlas cleared the looser snow with their paws. The object began to reveal itself. It wasn't a rock formation or a piece of old mining equipment. It was a perfectly flat, dark gray surface. As we cleared more snow, a shape emerged, a large, circular steel hatch at least 4 feet in diameter. It was incredibly well preserved, showing almost no signs of rust or decay, as if the ice had kept it in a state of suspended animation. In the center was a symbol I didn't recognize. A stylized raven clutching a key enclosed within a hexagon. It felt military, but not from any branch I knew. My training screamed at me. Unidentified structure. Potential threat. Pull back and observe. But the journalist, the explorer I never knew I had inside me, was captivated. Who would build something like this out here in the middle of nowhere and then bury it? The hatch was secured by a heavy recessed wheel lock. It took all my strength, my boots slipping on the icy metal, to turn it. With a groaning shudder that seemed to travel through the very bedrock, the lock disengaged. I braced myself and heaved the hatch open. A blast of cold, stale air rushed out, carrying a faint antiseptic smell like a hospital or a laboratory. It was the scent of a place that had been sealed away from the world for a very, very long time. Peering down, I saw only darkness. A steel ladder descended into an abyss. "Stay," I commanded the dogs. Luna whined, eager to explore. Atlas sat back on his haunches, his gaze fixed on the black opening, a low growl still rumbling in his chest. He knew, as I did, that we were crossing a threshold. We were leaving the natural world behind and stepping into something else. I clipped a headlamp to my beanie, took a deep breath, and began to climb down. The darkness swallowed me whole. The air grew colder, and the only sound was the metallic ring of my boots on the rungs. When my feet finally touched a solid floor, I swept the beam of my lamp across the space. I was standing in a ghost station. The room was a small airlock, but beyond it lay a corridor lined with doors. Everything was pristine. There were no signs of a struggle, no decay, just a layer of fine dust over everything. It was a time capsule. I walked through a common area where coffee mugs still sat on tables. In a barracks, beds were neatly made, personal effects left on nightstands, as if their owners had just stepped out for a moment. On a wall calendar, the month was circled in red pen. October 1983. These people had vanished overnight, nearly half a century ago. Atlas and Luna, unable to resist, had followed me down. Atlas stuck close to my leg, his body a tense coil of suspicion. Luna, however, trotted ahead, her nose to the ground, leading me deeper into the silent complex. She led me to the far end of the main corridor, to a door that was different from all the others. It was a heavy, reinforced glass door, with a large yellow and black biohazard symbol stenciled on it. A complex electronic keypad, dark and lifeless, was mounted beside a heavy spoked wheel like a submarine hatch. Through a small triple-paned porthole window, I aimed my headlamp. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a state-of-the-art laboratory that seemed impossibly advanced for 1983. Strange schematics were scrawled across whiteboards, and vials filled with dark liquids sat in racks. But my eyes were drawn to the center of the room. There, on a sterile metallic pedestal, sat a single object, a black, hard-shelled pelican case. It was military-grade, modern, and utterly out of place. It wasn't a relic from the past. It looked like it had been placed there yesterday. In that moment, standing in the chilling silence of that long-dead station, I knew two things with absolute certainty. First, whatever was in that case was the reason this entire facility existed. And second, the piece I had worked so hard to find was gone, replaced by a dangerous, all-consuming curiosity. I had to know what was inside. I had to open that door. That blast door was a challenge, a dare from a ghost. The electronic keypad was dead, its screen a blank black void. The real lock was the heavy spoked wheel in the center, a purely mechanical marvel of engineering that had likely been designed to withstand a direct impact. I braced my feet against the polished concrete floor and put my entire weight into turning it. It didn't budge, not a millimeter. It was as solid as the mountain around us. My years in special forces taught me one thing about locks like this: brute force was a fool's errand. They were designed by engineers who anticipated explosions and crowbars. They were puzzles, and every puzzle had a key. My gaze was drawn back to the keypad. Dead, yes, but why was it there? It was a redundant system, which meant it was either a secondary lock or more likely part of the unlocking sequence. I ran my gloved fingers over its surface. No power. I followed a thick, armored conduit running from the keypad into the wall. It had to draw power from somewhere. The station's primary generator was located in a sub-level, a place I found after a tense 10-minute search through the silent tomb-like corridors. Atlas stayed glued to my side, a low growl, a constant vibration in his chest, while Luna ranged ahead, her claws clicking softly on the floor, a nervous energy radiating from her. The generator room was cathedral-like, dominated by a massive diesel engine that had been silent for decades. The fuel tanks were bone dry. There was no way to bring the station back to life. But beside the main generator was a smaller secondary unit, an auxiliary power source. Its control panel was simpler. A small, faded placard read, "Emergency Systems, Life Support and Lab Containment Protocol." My heart began to pound. Life support meant nothing now, but lab containment, that was everything. The fuel gauge on this one was nearly full, a reserve that had never been touched. It was a long shot, but it was the only one I had. I knew my way around engines. With a prayer to whatever gods watch over forgotten places I worked, the manual primer checked the coolant levels and finally gripped the startup lever. The sound when it came was apocalyptic in the profound silence. A screech of tortured metal, a cough, a sputter, and then a deep shuddering roar as the auxiliary generator coughed to life. Emergency lights flickered on down the corridors, casting long dancing shadows. The station wasn't dead anymore. It was breathing. I raced back to the lab, my boots echoing in the now humming hallways. The keypad on the blast door was glowing with a soft green light. On its screen, a single prompt blinked: "Enter codename Nitraven." Nitraven. The symbol on the hatch. But what was the codename? I tried. The obvious, the date from the calendar, the station's designation number I'd found on a map. Access denied. Access denied. After the third failure, the screen flashed red. Warning: lockdown initiated. 2 attempts remaining. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up my throat. I pushed it down. Think, Keen. You don't guess. You analyze. This wasn't a password for a laptop. It was the key to a secret someone had died to protect. Where would a man hide the most important secret of his life? Not in a computer file. He'd keep it close. My mind went back to the barracks, to the personal effects left behind. I'd noticed the lead scientist's quarters were slightly larger than the others. A small nameplate on the door read Dr. Alistair Finch. I returned to his room, this time not as a curious explorer but as an investigator. The room was Spartan. A bed, a desk, a bookshelf. I ran my hands over every surface, checked under the mattress, behind the bookshelf. Nothing. Atlas, who had followed me in, nudged my hand and walked over to the desk and stared intently at a framed photograph sitting on its corner. It was a picture of a younger doctor. Finch and his daughter, a little girl with bright eyes and a missing front tooth. It was the only personal touch in the entire room. I picked it up. It felt slightly heavier than it should. My fingers traced the back of the cheap wooden frame and found it a tiny, almost imperceptible seam. Using the tip of my knife, I carefully pried the backing off. Taped to the inside was not a password but a small laminated card. On it was a complex star chart with constellations I didn't recognize, and handwritten at the bottom was a single word, Orion. My breath caught. It was a clue, not the answer. But it was everything. Back at the blast door, my hands were trembling slightly. I typed in ORION. The screen flashed green. Codename accepted. Biometric scan required. A small panel below the keypad slid open, revealing a dusty hand scanner. Another dead end. Finch was long gone. But my eyes fell on the star chart, still in my hand. It wasn't just a map of the stars. It was a diagram. In the military, we used similar overlays for grid coordinates. I looked at the keypad at the alphanumeric layout. The constellation of Orion, with its 3 distinct stars in the belt, formed a pattern, a simple 3-point pattern. It wasn't asking for Finch's hand. It was a final, brilliant misdirection. It was asking for the shape of his secret. Holding my breath, I pressed my thumb, index, and middle finger onto the scanner in the exact pattern of Orion's belt. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a soft hiss of pneumatics and the deep, satisfying clunk of heavy bolts, retracting the spoked wheel in the center of the door, spun freely in my hand. The door was unlocked. The air that wafted out of the lab was colder, still sterile, and without scent. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. Luna darted in ahead of me, her curiosity finally winning out, while Atlas stayed at the threshold, a silent, watchful sentinel. The pelican case sat on its pedestal waiting. I unfastened the latches and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a device of elegant, terrifying design. A sphere of polished black metal, about the size of a bowling ball, crisscrossed with lines of a material that seemed to drink the light. It wasn't a bomb. It was something else. Next to it was a ruggedized military laptop. I powered it on. The screen flickered to life, displaying a single password-protected video file, labeled Project Chimera, Final Demonstration. The password hint was a simple question. What is the key? My mind raced. The key. The raven on the hatch was clutching a key. What was Orion known for in mythology? The hunter. What does a hunter use? I typed in the word arrow. The video file opened. It was footage from a remote desert landscape, filmed from a high altitude. I watched as a small convoy of tanks and armored vehicles moved across the terrain. Then, the black sphere, the Chimera, was activated from a distant command post. There was no explosion, no sound, just a silent, invisible pulse of energy that radiated outwards. On the screen, the entire convoy simply died. Engines cut out. Lights went dark. Turrets froze. It was an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse, but unlike any I had ever seen. It wasn't a brute force blast from a nuclear detonation. It was surgical, precise, and seemingly scalable. It was a weapon that could cripple an entire nation's infrastructure, plunging it back into the Dark Ages without firing a single shot. The files accompanying the video confirmed my fears. Project Chimera wasn't just a prototype. It was a success. A doomsday weapon, created in secret, and then buried, its existence erased from all official records. Dr. Finch, I realized, hadn't just been a scientist. He had been its creator and its jailer. He had understood the horror he had unleashed and had locked it away from the world. And then I saw it. The final fatal detail I had overlooked in my desperate rush. As I closed the laptop, a small icon on the corner of the screen caught my eye. It was a satellite uplink symbol, and it was active. The moment I powered on that generator, I hadn't just woken up the station. I had woken up its silent guardian. The system was designed so that any attempt to access the lab's core files would send out a high-frequency encrypted distress signal. It wasn't a call for help. It was a hunter's beacon. A sudden piercing alarm blared through the station, the sound of a klaxon echoing off the metal walls. A robotic voice, calm and chilling, announced from hidden speakers: containment breached, asset compromised, location signal transmitted, and unlock protocol irreversible. The trap had been sprung. My blood ran cold. I looked at Atlas, whose ears were flat against his head, a furious snarl revealing his teeth. I looked at Luna, who was whining and pacing nervously by the door. They knew. We had stumbled into a cage, and I had just handed the key to the monster on the outside. We weren't alone in the Alaskan wilderness anymore. They were coming for their weapon, and we were standing in their way. That klaxon was a death knell. Every instinct, honed over a decade of warfare, screamed at me in a single, unified chorus: go! There was no time for careful consideration, no room for a strategic plan. There was only the primal, urgent need to move. I slammed the laptop shut, shoving it and the Chimera sphere into my reinforced pack. The weight was significant, a physical burden that mirrored the crushing gravity of the situation. It slowed me down, but leaving it behind was not an option. It was both the reason for the hunt and my only potential bargaining chip. With me now, I yelled, my voice raw. Luna was already a blur of white fur bolting down the corridor. Atlas, ever the loyal soldier, fell in at my heel, his body a tight spring of controlled aggression, his eyes scanning every shadow as we ran. The robotic voice continued its calm, terrifying monologue, on a loop, the station's automated systems narrating our impending doom. Location signal transmitted, asset compromised. We scrambled up the ladder, bursting out of the hatch into the blinding white of the Alaskan day. The world outside was no longer a sanctuary. It was an exposed, naked killing field. My cabin, my small bastion of peace, was miles away across treacherous open terrain. It was no longer a home. It was a trap waiting to be sprung. We had to disappear. We had to become ghosts again, but this time in our own backyard. My first thought was to cover our tracks. I heaved the heavy steel hatch back into place. The sound of its closing, a final, definitive end to our period of discovery. I piled snow over it, working frantically, trying to erase any sign of our intrusion. It was a futile gesture, I knew. They weren't looking for a disturbed patch of snow. They were following a precise GPS coordinate. They knew exactly where we were. And then, I saw it. At first, it was just a dark speck against the brilliant, achingly blue sky, almost invisible. It moved with an unnatural smoothness, without sound, without deviation. It wasn't a bird. My blood ran cold. It was a drone. Military grade, a silent, all-seeing eye, sent to confirm the target. It hung in the air for what felt like an eternity, a malevolent black star in the daylight. Its optical sensors no doubt zooming in on the three figures standing beside a freshly disturbed patch of snow. We had been found. The scout had arrived, which meant the hunters were not far behind. There was no time to get back to the cabin and its meager supplies. I had my rifle, a small emergency kit in my pack, and the dogs. That was it. We were exposed, outmanned, and about to be outgunned. My only advantage was the terrain. I had spent 2 years learning the rhythms of this land, its hidden valleys, its treacherous ridges, its dense forests that could swallow a man whole. It was time to see if the student had learned enough to outwit the masters. This way, I hissed, breaking into a desperate ground-eating run, not towards the relative safety of the cabin, but away from it, deeper into the trackless wilderness of the Alaska Range. We plunged into a thicket of snow-laden spruce, the branches whipping at my face, the deep powder sucking at my boots. Behind us, the drone pivoted silently and began to follow. Hours bled into a blur of frantic movement. We scrambled up rocky inclines, waded through ice-choked streams to mask our scent, and pushed through dense undergrowth that tore at my clothes. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind, sounded like the approaching thud of helicopter rotors. The paranoia was a physical entity, a cold presence that rode on my shoulders, whispering of the futility of our flight. Atlas was a machine, his powerful legs churning through the snow, his focus absolute. Luna, in her element, was our guide, finding the paths of least resistance, her boundless energy, a source of awe and inspiration. As dusk began to settle, painting the snow in shades of violet and blood orange, we found temporary shelter in a shallow cave, carved out of a granite cliff face. I was exhausted, my lungs burning, my muscles screaming in protest. I collapsed against the cold stone, pulling the heavy pack into my lap. Atlas immediately took up a watch position at the cave's entrance, his body oriented back the way we had come, a silent, unblinking sentinel. That night, huddled together for warmth, the true nature of our predicament settled in. I pulled out the scientist's laptop. The battery was critically low. I had one chance. I searched through Finch's files, not for more data on the weapon, but for a sign of his own escape plan. He must have known they would come for him. He must have had a contingency. And there, buried in a corrupted data log, I found it, a short, encrypted text file. The decryption key was the same as the video password, ARROW. The file opened to reveal a map. It showed a remote, abandoned weather station perched on the treacherous slopes of Denali, over 100 miles away. A single line of text accompanied it. Seward's Folly. The only way out. My final broadcast. Seward's Folly. It had to be a communications outpost, a place with the power to broadcast the truth to the world, far from any network they could control. It was a desperate, almost suicidal destination. But it was the only destination we had. We were no longer just running from something. We were running to something. The days that followed were a monotonous cycle of brutal, relentless movement. We moved mostly at dawn and dusk, using the low light to our advantage, resting during the harsh light of midday in whatever cover we could find. We were fugitives, living off the land, my hunting skills pushed to their absolute limit. I rationed the few energy bars I had, giving the larger shares to the dogs. Their strength was my strength. On the third day, we saw them. We were traversing a high windswept ridge when Atlas suddenly flattened himself to the ground, a low whine escaping his throat. I dropped beside him, pulling out my binoculars. Far below in the valley, 2 black unmarked snowmobiles were moving slowly. 4 men dressed in Arctic tactical gear, their rifles held at the ready. One of them held a device, a tracker, sweeping it across the landscape. They were professionals, cold, efficient, and relentless. We lay motionless for over an hour, pressed into the snow, the wind biting at our exposed skin until they moved on. They were methodical. They were sweeping the area in a grid pattern. It was only a matter of time. That night the attack came. We had taken shelter in a dense grove of ancient pines when the forest went unnaturally silent. The usual chorus of nocturnal animals ceased. Atlas's head shot up, a deep guttural growl rumbling in his chest. A second later, I heard it, the faint whump 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 of rotors, still miles away but closing fast. They found us. I whispered, my hand on Atlas's back. Time to go. We didn't run. We melted into the darkness. But they were faster. The helicopter swooped over the valley, its powerful searchlight cutting a brilliant white cone through the night, turning the forest into a stark landscape of black and white. It was a prison yard, and we were the inmates. Then the world exploded. The first shots were not from rifles. They were small, concussive charges fired from the helicopter, designed not to kill, but to herd. They detonated in the trees around us, sending showers of snow and splintered wood raining down. They were driving us, pushing us out of the dense cover towards an open riverbed. It was a classic pincer movement, with the helicopter as the hammer and a ground team no doubt disembarking from the snowmobiles as the anvil. We were trapped. The riverbed was a moonlit expanse of ice and rock, a perfect kill zone. To stay in the trees was to be flushed out. To run into the open was suicide. My mind raced, sifting through years of tactical training. Create a diversion, break their pattern. Luna, go, I commanded, pointing away from the river towards the darkest part of the forest. Go make some noise, she understood. A bark of defiance, and she was gone. A white streak in the darkness. At the same time, I turned to Atlas. Watch my back. I took a deep breath, raised my rifle, and aimed for the searchlight. It was a 1-in-a-million shot in the dark, but it was the only play I had. I exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and the forest erupted with the deafening crack of my rifle. For a glorious second, the searchlight flickered and died, plunging the world back into darkness. Shouts of confusion erupted from the unseen ground team. In that moment of chaos, I ran not away, but parallel to the river, using the temporary darkness as a shield. Atlas was at my side, a silent shadow. A moment later, a cacophony of barking and snarling erupted from where I had sent Luna. She had found their flank. The diversion was working. We sprinted through the night, the sounds of the firefight, for they were now shooting at ghosts and echoes fading behind us. An hour later, deep in the mountains, I let out a low, two-toned whistle. A few moments later, Luna appeared unharmed, her tongue lolling out in a triumphant grin. Atlas greeted her with a low woof of approval. We had survived the first contact, but it was a costly victory. They knew our general location, and they knew we would fight back. The hunt had just become personal. We were no longer just an asset to be recovered. We were a threat to be eliminated. The flight from the helicopter attack had cost us dearly. We had escaped, but we were running on fumes, a desperate trio pushing against the relentless grinding force of the Alaskan winter. The world had shrunk to the next step, and the one after that. My thoughts were a frozen slurry of exhaustion, tactical assessment, and a single burning objective: Seward's Folly. Dr. Finch's last resort had become my only hope. The blizzard that had been threatening for days finally descended, a suffocating curtain of white that turned the landscape into a formless, roaring void. It was a curse and a blessing. It would hide us, but it would also kill us if we stopped moving. After another day of grueling travel, we saw it. Through a momentary break in the swirling snow, the skeletal fingers of radio towers clawed at the gray sky. Seward's Folly. It was perched on a knife-edge ridge, a collection of rusted, prefabricated buildings clinging to the mountainside like a dying man's last grip. It was the bleakest, most desolate place I had ever seen, and it was our sanctuary. But as we got closer, a cold dread snaked its way up my spine. The blizzard was our cover, but it wasn't perfect, and they were professionals. They wouldn't just be searching the valleys. They would anticipate my destination. My training took over, and I saw the station not as a refuge, but as a tactical problem. They would hold the high ground. They would control the single approach. We weren't walking towards a sanctuary. We were walking into a fatal funnel. I stopped us behind a rocky outcrop, the wind screaming around us. Atlas pressed against my leg, a low growl already vibrating in his chest. He sensed them too. I pulled out my binoculars, wiping the snow from the lenses. There, two figures barely visible through the snow, positioned in the main observation deck of the primary building. Snipers. They had us zeroed in. A third figure patrolled the perimeter near a smaller generator shed. They had anticipated us. We were pinned down, exhausted, and hopelessly outgunned. The hunt was over, or so they thought. They had the technology, the numbers, and the high ground, but I had the storm, a lifetime of asymmetrical warfare experience, and a pack that thought and moved as one. They were waiting for the hunted to stumble into their trap. They weren't expecting the hunted to bite back. I had to change the rules of the game. I had to make the storm my weapon. We go dark. I whispered more to myself than to the dogs. I pointed towards a deep ravine that ran parallel to the main approach, a treacherous but hidden path. Luna, listen. I looked her in the eyes. Those chips of glacial ice, sharp with intelligence. You know the sound. The whistle. I need you to draw them. One of them. Make him move. She gave a soft yip of understanding. She knew the game. She was a ghost in the snow, a phantom of pure speed. She disappeared into the whiteout, moving downwind. I turned to Atlas. You're with me, boy. We go quiet. He needed no further instruction. He was the shadow, the silent hammer. We moved into the ravine, the snow sometimes up to our waists, the wind erasing our tracks almost as soon as we made them. It was a slow, agonizing crawl. Above us, I knew the snipers were scanning their thermal scopes, likely rendered nearly useless by the sheer intensity of the blizzard. After 20 minutes that felt like an eternity, we were in position below the generator shed. I waited, my body screaming from the cold, my heart a slow, steady drum. Then from far to our left, a sound cut through the howl of the wind, a long, mournful, and utterly wild wolf's howl. But it wasn't a wolf. It was Luna. It was a perfect imitation, designed to sound like a lone animal, a distraction, a curiosity. I watched the patrolling mercenary. He stopped, his head tilting. He spoke into his comms, likely reporting the sound. A moment later, he started moving away from his post towards the source of the howl, his rifle held at the ready. He was breaking formation. It was the mistake I had been waiting for. Now I breathed. Atlas and I exploded from the ravine. We covered the 50 yards to the generator shed in seconds. The mercenary, his back to us, was a perfect target, but a gunshot would give us away. This had to be silent. Atlas was a blur of sable fur. He didn't bark, didn't make a sound. He hit the man low and hard, taking out his legs. Before the mercenary's surprised gasp could fully form, I was on him, my knife finding its mark. It was brutal, efficient, and silent. I dragged him behind the shed, stripping him of his suppressed rifle, his ammunition, and most importantly, his thermal goggles. I strapped the goggles on and flipped them down. The world bloomed into a grainy black and white landscape of heat signatures. The blizzard was a swirling gray mess, but the two snipers in the main building glowed like twin suns. The odds had just improved. The leader, I knew, would be the one who didn't move. He would be the calm center of the storm. One of the heat signatures was static, positioned perfectly. The other was starting to move, pacing nervously, likely trying to raise the third man on the radio. He was the weak link. I left Atlas on guard and circled around the main building, using the rusted derelict structures as cover. The wind was my ally, masking any sound I made. I found a secondary entrance, its door long since ripped from its hinges. I slipped inside the suppressed rifle, a cold, grim comfort in my hands. The interior was a maze of dark corridors and empty rooms, the wind whistling through broken windows. Through the thermals, I saw the nervous sniper moving towards the stairwell, coming down to investigate. I found a small dark office and weighted my rifle, pressed against the doorframe. The footsteps grew louder. He stepped into the corridor, sweeping his rifle from side to side. He was good, but he was expecting a threat from outside, not from within. I squeezed the trigger twice. The suppressed shots were barely audible over the storm. The second sniper crumpled to the floor. 2 down. Now it was just the leader. He would know. The silence from his men would be a screaming alarm. I didn't have time to be tactical anymore. I had to get to the radio room, which the map on Finch's laptop had shown was on the top floor, right next to the observation deck where he was holed up. I took the stairs, my boots silent on the grated metal. As I reached the top floor, a volley of automatic fire tore through the wall beside me, sending splinters and plaster flying. He knew I was coming. He had anticipated my route. I dove into an adjacent room, my shoulder stinging, where a stray piece of shrapnel had hit me. He had me pinned down. "You're good, Keen," a voice yelled, distorted by the wind. "But you're alone. You brought a ghost story to a gunfight. Give up the asset, and I might let your dogs live." He was trying to draw me out, to make me emotional. It was a rookie mistake. A professional never underestimates his enemy. I stayed silent. I heard a soft scratching at the door behind me. Atlas. He had followed my trail. I held up a hand and he flattened himself to the floor, a silent promise of violence. The final confrontation was a deadly game of chess. I used a piece of broken mirror to peer around the corner. He was dug in using a heavy console as cover. I needed a distraction. I looked at Atlas. The window, I whispered, pointing to a large snow-crusted window at the far end of the room. Break it. He understood. He shot across the room like a cannonball and crashed through the window, a shower of glass and snow exploding outwards. The leader flinched instinctively, turning his rifle towards the sound for a fraction of a second. It was the only opening I needed. I burst out of the room, firing a controlled burst at his position. He fired back, and the world became a blur of muzzle flashes and screaming ricochets. A bullet tore through the flesh of my left shoulder, a white-hot poker that sent a shockwave of pain through my body. My rifle flew from my numb fingers. I stumbled backward, crashing to the floor. He stood over me, the barrel of his rifle aimed at my head. His thermal goggles gave his face an inhuman, monstrous quality. "It's over," he said, his voice calm. But it wasn't. From the broken window, a savage roar of pure protective rage erupted. Atlas, a demon of fur and fury, launched himself through the air. He wasn't aiming for the man. He was aiming for the weapon. His jaws clamped down on the rifle, shaking his head violently, the sound of snapping metal and the man's curse of shock and pain filling the air. At the same moment, a white streak shot past me from the stairwell. Luna. She didn't attack the man. She darted straight for my fallen pack, which held the chimera and the laptop. She grabbed a strap in her teeth and began dragging it away from the fight, protecting the mission. The leader, disarmed and shocked, tried to draw his sidearm, but Atlas was relentless. That was my chance. Gasping through the pain, I drew my own pistol with my good hand and fired twice. The leader collapsed. It was over. I staggered to my feet, my vision swimming. My pack was safe. My dogs, my loyal, brilliant soldiers, were unharmed. Leaning on the console for support, I made my way into the radio room. The equipment was ancient, covered in frost, but the emergency power from the generator shed was still on. With trembling, bloody fingers, I plugged in Finch's laptop, my shoulder screaming in agony. I found the broadcast function, attached the files, and aimed the satellite dish. My finger hovered over the transmit button. I was about to give a ghost his voice. With trembling fingers, I hit transmit. The files screamed out into the storm, a ghost's final warning, broadcast to a world that had forgotten him. We were rescued, and the official story has a clean ending. The corporation behind Project Chimera was exposed, its leaders arrested, and the weapons secured. They call me a hero. They honor Dr. Finch's sacrifice. Here, in a new cabin, with my shoulder healing and my pack sleeping by the fire, it seems we've finally found the peace we were searching for. But the world is never that simple. That signal wasn't a clean shot. It was a desperate blast into the digital ether. And it leaves me with one chilling question. Who else was listening? What happens when the blueprint for a doomsday weapon doesn't just fall into the right hands, but into all of them? Our fight saved the world from one threat, but I fear we may have armed a dozen more. Our journey is far from over. If you believe this story must continue, let me know in the comments below what you think is coming for us next. Like this video to show your support, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the rest of the world comes knocking. Because the storm has passed, but the echoes are just beginning.